Hello everyone, I'm Aditya Ramesh and this is Care Crafts Project Fremont. Today, instead of covering one type of bodily disease or disorder, we're going to be talking about three types of brain cancer. And in order to help us, we have Dr. David Rogawski. Feel free to introduce yourself.
Great, yeah, so I'm Dave Rogawski. I am a neuro-oncologist and a research fellow in Michelle Mange's lab at Stanford. As a brief background, I was, once in high school and, interested in science and medicine, and after a long string of training in college and medical school and residency and fellowship, I'm finally independently seeing patients and conducting research on brain tumors. And I'm happy to talk to you guys today about a variety of different brain tumors and how we diagnose them and how we treat them.
All of us on our team want to pursue this kind of like career, something in the medical field. So what kind of motivated you as a kid in high school to pursue something like this?
My path kind of initially started really in an interest in science in general, and actually less so in medicine. So I was always interested in chemistry and biology. I had a fantastic AP chemistry class in high school that really got me kind of very excited about research and lab work. And then I went to undergraduate at Williams College, and I think that's where even more my interest in science really solidified. So I was lucky enough to have a few different really formative laboratory experiences each summer that I was in college. So the first summer I worked at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute with Dr. Lois Green. And we were working on a basic neuroscience project investigating the function of a very important protein in human disease and how it relates to a condition called Huntington's disease. And then my second summer, I was at Williams College, at my home institution, working in a lab studying plant biochemistry, of all things. So I kind of bounced around and did a lot of different projects. And then the last summer in undergrad, I was working in a lab at the University of Michigan, looking at a type of bacteria called Proteus mirabilis that causes urinary tract infections. And then my senior year in college, I worked in a lab, did a senior thesis, and it was also a microbiology project working on a type of bacteria that infects plants and kind of the basic pathogenic mechanisms of that bacteria. So I would encourage anyone, if you're like you guys, if you're interested in science, if you're interested in research, reach out to labs. It could start as early as high school. I never worked in a lab during high school. I started in college, but as soon as you can, when you're in college or even in high school, reach out to a professor. It may take a few tries, because they're busy, but be persistent because part of their job is to help students learn and train students. So those first few laboratory experiences are just so formative to get you excited about research, about discovering new things that people have never seen before. That's how it all started for me. Yeah.
Everyone here really wants to do research. Me personally, I'm really interested in research, especially on like psychology and then like brain and growth connection and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And we actually did write an article about Huntington's disease, so it was great
Okay.
to mention that.
Great. Yeah.
But yeah, so obviously you've done a lot of research and you've been around doing a lot of research. What's some of your more recent research about like neuro-oncology that you've done?
Yes, yeah, that's a great question. So I'm working in Dr. Michelle Mange's lab at Stanford. She is a world-renowned neuro-oncologist and neuroscientist, and I'm extremely fortunate to work in her lab. My project is continuing some very fundamental discoveries that she's made over the past 10 years, showing that normal neurons in the brain, in fact, stimulate the growth of a type of brain tumor called glioma. And this was a very important discovery that has now become fundamental to neuro-oncology and our understanding of gliomas. And what I'm working on is leveraging this new paradigm, she's really opened up a whole field. It's called cancer neuroscience. And I'm working to leverage that new paradigm to develop new therapies for glioma. I'm particularly interested in small molecule drugs. And so, now that we know that normal neurons stimulate gliomas, and we also know that gliomas actually derive from early neural cells and early glial cells that are present in all of our brains, they share a lot of the same basic neuroscience mechanisms. So glioma cells respond to neurotransmitters. They have ion channels. They have a lot of the same neuroscience pathways that are present in our normal neurons and our normal glial cells in our brain. And it turns out that we have a lot of drugs already that act on a lot of those neurotransmitter pathways. These are drugs that we already use to treat conditions like epilepsy or psychosis or depression. And so we have a lot of drugs kind of already in our toolkit, and my research is really aimed at seeing which of these drugs we could actually use and reposition as a new brain tumor therapy. Because we have really rapidly accumulating evidence that these pathways, these basic neuroscience pathways, are in fact very crucial to glioma growth. And so I think it's an exciting project, and we've already found some small molecules, some novel small molecule drugs that we think we can use against glioma, and so I'm actively testing them in various different models of the disease.
So there is a lot of work that's put into finding these new drugs and how to combat the issues that come with gliomas, for example.
Yeah.
And AI and machinery has been an increasing part of every industry. So
yeah,
what kind of way have you been using new technology to improve your studies and improve how quickly you'll find some sort of treatment or prevention to gliomas or any other type of brain cancer?
Yes, I mean that is such an important question. And I honestly think our field has so much to benefit from using AI, and we are still at the very earliest days. One example that's just come up in my lab that just comes to mind that I'll just mention is, so there's a technique called electron microscopy, where we can basically it's a super high resolution microscope, and we can see individual organelles inside cells. We can see synapses, so we can see connections between neurons. We can see connections between neurons and glioma cells. And we use this technique to understand glioma and how it integrates with the normal brain. But a problem is that it can be problematic to identify, based on this super high resolution, super blown up image, which cells are the neurons, which cells are normal glial cells, normal cells, and which cells are the cancerous glioma cells. And there's not a sort of immediately intuitive way to figure that out, but AI may be able to do that. So artificial intelligence may be able to pick up on subtle differences between the glioma cells and the normal cells that humans may not readily appreciate. And after a training period, the AI may be able to do that way better than a human. And that would really accelerate our research, our studies in this particular area. We could really see how the tumor is infiltrating and integrating at a super high resolution. We just have to be able to figure out what's a cancer cell and what's not. So that's just one example. I mean, a very specific example. I am sure that there are many others, and I'm super excited to see where AI can lead us.
So do you use electron microscopy to test whether your drugs are working properly?
So I don't personally use electron microscopy at this moment in my project, but I could envision an application for it. If a little bit down the road, we find some very promising drugs, then we may want to better understand how those drugs are affecting neuron glioma interactions at a super high resolution. And so that could be an application for electron microscopy in my particular project. Yeah.
Without further ado, let's get into the interview. How it's going to work is our research team is split into 3 groups. Each group will cover each type of brain cancer. And we're going to start with the glioblastomas, which is covered by Sari and Ishika.
A quick summary before we begin of glioblastomas is that they are an aggressive type of cancer that originates from rapidly growing cells in the brain or spinal cord. It accounts for more than 12,000 cases in the United States each year and is one of the most deadly forms of brain cancer. This disease begins when astrocytes, brain cells that provide nutrients and protect the brain from diseases in the blood, mutate, causing them to grow and divide uncontrollably. Due to the brain's dense network of blood vessels, cancer cells can multiply quickly, making glioblastomas the fastest growing of all brain tumors. Over time, glioblastoma can cause seizures, cognitive decline, and overall reduced quality of life because of its high impact on brain function. Now let's move on to the questions.
Why are glioblastomas more common in older ages?
That's a good question. So just to preface it a little bit, you're totally right that glioblastomas are more common in older age groups. Just so you know, there are other very aggressive high-grade gliomas that are more common in younger patients. And so part of that is explained by the fact that at different points in development of the brain, some cells are more or less vulnerable to being transformed into cancer. So there are some cells we know that at particular point in childhood, because of the normal neurodevelopment trajectory, they happen to be particularly vulnerable to getting turned into cancer cells. So that's a slightly different type of glioma, but it's important to recognize that neurodevelopment and the course of our development over our life does explain some of the variability in the time at which different high-grade gliomas arise. Glioblastoma, as you guys already said, being the most common high-grade glioma, it does parallel a trajectory that a lot of cancers follow. A lot of different types of cancers are more common in older age. There's a couple different reasons for that. One is that as we get older, there's more time to accumulate more mutations that can trigger cancer. Another reason is that as we get older, our immune systems don't work quite as well. And our immune system is important for removing any precancerous or early cancerous cells from the body and the brain. So that's likely another reason why glioblastoma is more common in older people.
In your own research, do you work more with the kind of cancer cell that targets younger people or older people?
I do, yeah. I do tend to work more, and just to put a name on it, it's called diffuse midline glioma. This is the type of glioma that's a little bit more common in kids. It can affect adults, but it's a little bit more common in kids. So yes, in my research, I'm working on that particular type of glioma, diffuse midline glioma. And we also work with glioblastoma as well, but a little bit less so, yeah.
And for what reason are glioblastomas unusually persistent even after chemotherapy and other therapies?
Yeah, I mean, they hit the nail on the head about why this is such a horrible disease. Unfortunately, glioblastomas cannot be cured by surgery. And the reason is that they send out tentacles of invading tumor cells that spread, we know, throughout the brain, even early in the course of the disease, even to areas that we can't even see on an MRI scan. They're single cells that have infiltrated already, and so when the surgeon takes out the part of the tumor that we can see on the scan, we know that there are still these tentacles of tumor cells that have spread to other parts of the brain. So that's why the standard of care usually is to follow the surgery with radiation and chemotherapy. And although radiation and chemotherapy can stun the cancer cells and halt them from growing for a period of time, in the vast majority of patients, the tumor ultimately becomes resistant and recurs.
So to what extent may glioblastoma impact a patient's mental processes or personality over time?
Yeah, it's another good question. So, the brain is our personality. That's what controls our personality, as well as our movement, our thoughts, our emotions. And so it really depends a lot on where the glioblastoma arises, in terms of what parts of the brain it affects. So the frontal lobes are generally where a lot of our personality, our motivation, our goal-directed behavior lies. And so for tumors that arise in the frontal lobes, personality can be affected early. And then just to give a couple other examples, vision tends to be in the back of the brain. So for tumors that arise in that back part of the brain called the occipital region, vision could be affected. Memory and language tend to be in the temporal lobe, particularly the dominant temporal lobe. And so for tumors that arise there, language could be affected first. So it really depends where the tumor originates. And then I'll just say, because these tumors send out these tentacles and invade parts of the brain very far from where they started, it turns out they often go to the very deepest part of the brain, called the brain stem. And that is such a crucial part of the brain where all pathways are crossing and networks are integrating. And so when the tumors invade that very key part of the brain stem, level of alertness and consciousness can be affected. So even things more profound than your personality, you can really even have trouble staying awake. So that's more at the end stage of the disease, but is unfortunately very common.
Once symptoms of glioblastoma are treated, if the patient stops taking the drug, will the symptoms worsen again?
Yeah, so good question. So the radiation and the chemotherapy primarily are directed at the tumor control. So they're directed at killing the cancer cells that we can kill. It's stunning and halting the cancer cells that can be stunned. They generally don't help as much with symptoms. In fact, sometimes there can be some swelling after radiation, and so the symptoms can even get transiently worse. For controlling symptoms, we have two medications that we commonly use. So the first one being steroids. So steroids tend to shrink the tumor and prevent it from pushing on some of the important parts of the brain that are responsible for the symptoms. And we also have a drug called Avastin or bevacizumab that works similarly to steroids but without a lot of the side effects, and it's even a little bit more powerful as well. That drug is also very good at shrinking the tumor, at least temporarily, and decreasing side effects. And yeah, to answer your question, sometimes when those medicines are stopped, then the symptoms can come back as the tumor swells up again.
And in what ways could a patient's genetic background influence the effectiveness of treatments like radiation therapy?
Just a step back, there are some genetic conditions that predispose individuals to glioblastoma. Just to name a few, there's a condition called Lee-Fraumeni syndrome, where you are born with a defect in DNA repair. There's another condition in the same family called Lynch syndrome, where your ability to repair DNA is also compromised. So patients with those conditions, just at baseline, are more likely to develop glioblastoma. In terms of tailoring treatment to those particular conditions, in practice, usually at least the initial standard treatment is very similar, whether you have one of these genetic predispositions or not. However, I will say that sometimes when you have a defect in DNA repair, your tumor accumulates way more mutations than other typical people with the glioblastoma. So your tumor just has way, like an order of magnitude more mutations than, or several orders of magnitude more mutations than the typical glioblastoma. And all of those mutations can provide fodder for the immune system to recognize that tumor potentially as abnormal and to go attack it. And so, at least in theory and sometimes in practice, we can use therapies that activate and enhance our immune system to go after and fight those particular glioblastomas that have a lot of mutations. That's one area where the immune system could potentially be leveraged because there's so much abnormal proteins, abnormal genes, that the immune system, if it just gets a little bit nudged, it can really go in and attack the glioblastoma. And so that's an active area of research, but it's something that we even look into. We look and see if our patients have that particular hypermutation signature even now, so that we might be able to use one of these immune-based therapies.
So what are some safety challenges needed to be met to apply gene therapy to the central nervous system?
Yes. So gene therapy is a kind of a big umbrella term. And we are definitely using, in research, we're testing a lot of therapies that use gene therapy. Perhaps the one that comes to mind most immediately, because it's part of my lab's research, is CAR T cells. So just to give you a little bit of background, you may have heard of CAR T cells. It stands for chimeric antigen receptor T cells. So it's a pretty fancy and involved treatment, and very powerful treatment. So what it involves is the patient's own white blood cells are removed from their body using a blood draw, and then those living white blood cells are brought into a laboratory, and using gene therapy, a particular gene is introduced into the white blood cell so that it recognizes and attacks the glioblastoma tumor. And then once those white blood cells have been engineered, they're infused back into the patient. Depending on the particular research setting or the particular CAR T trial, they might even be infused directly into the tumor or into the brain. And then the CAR T cells can infiltrate into the brain and go and attack the glioblastoma. And so this is an active area of research that hasn't been an approved therapy yet, but this is an active area of research. It's extremely exciting. My lab in particular, Michelle's lab, has developed a particular CAR T cell that goes after diffuse midline glioma, the one that's more common in kids. And it's very, very promising. A number of patients have responded, and some have even responded for a really long time. So it needs to be optimized a little bit, but it's something that is really promising. And you asked about safety. So safety, when you're doing research, safety is always at the top of your mind. First do no harm, especially when you're using these very powerful immune-based treatments that can have a lot of side effects. So it's true that CAR T cells, because they're living cells, living activated lymphocytes, they can cause swelling in the brain. They can cause sort of a diffuse inflammatory state in the brain. So we have to be very careful. The patients are monitored in the hospital. They might need steroids. They might need other immunosuppressants. They might need, if the brain is really swelling, they might need a device to go, that's basically a tube into the middle of their brain to help release the pressure. So anytime a patient's treated with CAR T cells, there's always a lot of doctors involved, neurosurgeons, neuro-oncologists, neurologists that carefully, and now there's neuroimmuno-oncologists, so they monitor the patient very, very carefully, to make sure that these side effects don't happen, or if they do happen, they're managed. Yeah.
So to add on to that, what are the ethical considerations involved in using experimental treatments or clinical trials for glioblastoma patients? Yeah.
I mean, good piggyback off of that last question, because so the main principles that we live by in research, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice. We want to make these treatments applicable and accessible to everyone. We want to try to help people if we can. We don't want to hurt anybody. So it seems kind of self-evident, but these are important principles that we need to remember every time we're doing research, even if it's something as horrible as glioblastoma. So every one of our research projects goes through very detailed review. At Stanford, we have something called an institutional review board that carefully reviews the research protocol. There's often feedback that goes back and forth between the reviewers and the researchers to make sure that the patients understand the risks, that the risks are not outsized compared to what's generally acceptable in that particular disease, to make sure that the treatment can be distributed fairly among the patients. So it's part and parcel of clinical research. You have to make sure that ethical principles are abided by.
Next, what role does artificial intelligence or machine learning currently play in diagnosing or predicting glioblastoma progression?
Yeah, I mean, another good question about AI, and an area where I think we really have so much room to grow. It's very early days. One thing that comes to mind is there's a big problem in our field about being able to determine if, so basically a patient is treated with surgery and radiation and chemotherapy, and then, we follow them over time with MRI scans. And the problem often comes up where the MRI looks different. There might be some more swelling or some new abnormal signals. And we have to come up with a decision about whether those changes represent tumor growth or if they represent changes due to radiation, like just kind of swelling or inflammation. And the problem is that on our standard MRI scans, those things look very similar. People have come up with new MRI techniques to try to differentiate. But I think that's sort of a very, to me, a very apparent way where AI could be helpful is if we have an AI that could analyze MRI scans, and it could quickly analyze thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of MRI scans, and it would learn which ones are treatment effect and which ones are tumor progression. And I'm sure it would learn and realize some features that are not apparent to humans, even experienced radiologists, and it might be able to determine which one is tumor growth versus radiation or treatment effect.
Yeah. In your opinion, what are the most promising new approaches in treating glioblastoma?
Yes, so this is going to be kind of biased by my lab that I work in and what I'm working on. Our Michelle's lab is really pioneers in, I would say, two big areas of glioblastoma research that, in my opinion, are very exciting. So the first would be the CAR T cells that I mentioned. That's a very, very powerful immunotherapy that's already shown a lot of promise in multiple types of glioma. And there are other immunotherapies too. There are other ways that we could leverage the immune system to go and attack the cancer. I think those are all very exciting. And then the other, super exciting avenue that I'm focusing on and I'm interested in is cancer neuroscience. So now that we know, all of the different neural properties of glioma that are so important to its growth, and we know a little bit more about how gliomas interact with the neurons in the brain around, and we know how important all of these interactions are for stimulating glioma growth. I think it's time to develop some therapies to target those pathways, target those neuron to glioma interactions to decrease growth of the tumor and help patients.
Okay, well, I think that's all from us. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Aditya.
Hello, I'm Jaden, and we will be presenting about meningioma. A quick intro about meningioma before we hop in. Meningioma is a tumor that starts growing in the membrane, but it can spread to the spinal cord or brain. And this spreading is usually happening in the meninges. Now, even though this tumor mainly affects the brain, it is not always classified as a brain tumor, as it can also affect the central nervous system, or CNS for short, which also makes it a CNS tumor. Now, this tumor is also mainly targets women, and it is also found a lot in older ages. And it is found a lot in older ages because of its ability to grow very slowly or very exponentially and cause no symptoms to the patient. This makes it very hard to identify when it is actually growing, as it will not cause any symptoms. To properly identify this tumor, surgery is usually needed, as a piece of the tissue is usually taken out and then sent to a neuropathologist to identify what kind of tumor this is. Now, moving on to the questions. On a molecular level, how exactly is meningioma formed? Due to hormonal changes or a specific genetic mutation?
Good question. So, meningiomas arise due to mutations. There are genetic conditions that people are born with that may predispose people to meningiomas. So the one that comes to mind is a condition called neurofibromatosis type 2. And that's due to mutations in a gene called NF2. And so people with that are born with a mutation in that gene are very susceptible to meningiomas. And it turns out that gene is also mutated in a lot of people with sporadic meningiomas, that aren't born with that genetic condition, but they acquire that mutation later in life. And so that's an example of the NF2 gene is an example of one gene that's really important in meningioma pathophysiology. And there's a few others, but generally meningiomas are ultimately caused at the root by genetic mutations. Now, hormones is an interesting question because, as you mentioned in the intro, meningiomas are more common in women than men, particularly older women than older men. And meningiomas do express some of the receptors for estrogen or progestins. And so there's some thought that hormones like estrogen may be involved in stimulating or promoting meningioma growth. That's likely true to some extent, but when it comes to treatment, we've found that inhibiting those hormone receptors with drugs that block estrogen or block progestin signaling, unfortunately haven't turned out to be very effective. So it seems like those hormones are more involved in initial formation and development of the tumor, but over time, those hormonal pathways are no longer important for the tumor growth. Yeah.
So you said that mutations are the main cause, at least. So how would new technologies such as gene editing technologies, like something we've looked at is CRISPR, do you think those could have an effect on prevention and treatment?
Yes, I think so. Particularly for those genetic conditions that I mentioned, like neurofibromatosis type 2, or there's a few others where patients are predisposed to forming meningiomas. So as you know, CRISPR is it's now been around for several years. It's a very powerful technique to edit the genome, and so it's certainly a very promising therapy. If we could remove or edit that altered NF2 gene in patients, either early on or perhaps more practically, if we could edit that out of their tumor, then that would be potentially a very viable therapeutic strategy. Yeah.
We know that meningioma is very hard to detect because it doesn't cause a lot of symptoms. Does things like imaging or symptom monitoring enhance early diagnosis?
So meningiomas are extremely common, and the truth is that many of them never cause anyone any symptoms or any problems at all. And so I think one of the big challenges with meningiomas is knowing which meningiomas we need to treat and which ones we can just safely observe. Now that so many people are getting MRI scans for all sorts of different indications, headaches or seizures or other conditions. We often see a meningioma that just shows up on the scan, and it's not the cause of the patient's symptoms, and oftentimes it's very slow growing or not growing at all. So I think we don't really need an earlier detection method for meningioma. We need an earlier detection method for the aggressive meningiomas, which are actually a very small subset of all meningiomas. And so that's being looked at a lot actually in research. We're looking at ways, once we get a piece of the meningioma and we can test it for different mutations, we're looking at ways that we can identify particular mutations that would make the tumor more aggressive or more likely to come back.
So if a meningioma tends to not cause that many problems, do you guys tend to let it go, or is there still some sort of removal process?
Yes. So if a meningioma is relatively small and it's not causing any symptoms, then we often just observe it, because the vast majority of meningiomas are low grade, they're very slow growing, and a lot of times they don't end up causing problems. The reasons to intervene on a meningioma would be, well, if it's causing symptoms, and so some meningiomas grow to the point where they start pressing on the normal brain, and they might cause weakness or numbness or difficulty speaking, or they could cause a seizure. So anytime a meningioma causes a symptom, generally speaking, we want to treat it. And I'm happy to talk about the different treatment options, but to answer your question, so symptoms, size, if you have a really big meningioma and you're worried that it's going to be causing symptoms pretty soon, that would be a reason to treat it. And I think also location, would play a role. And again, one of the things that I didn't really mention earlier is that a lot of these decisions are made in discussion with my colleagues in neurosurgery and radiation oncology. We usually discuss these sort of patients and decide together. So this is a kind of a multidisciplinary discussion, but I think symptoms, size, and then location. So if the tumor is in a part of the brain or at the base of the brain where there's a lot of vital structures, vital nerves, vital blood vessels, then we would be more likely to intervene and treat it.
In what ways do hormonal fluctuations, particularly during pregnancy or menopause, influence the growth of many meningiomas?
Right. So we know that hormones are involved, at least in the initiation of meningioma. We know that meningiomas are more common in women than men. I am not aware of any kind of strong data about fluctuations in pregnancy that would necessarily affect the growth. I think those would be kind of hard, those would be challenging studies to do. You'd have to have a cohort of patients that have meningioma and have them get pregnant and see how the tumor changes. And I think you also asked about menopause.
Yeah.
So after menopause, estrogen levels go way down. So so the thought is that the meningiomas are growing during the period of the woman, or at least are stimulated to develop during the period of the woman's life when she's exposed to estrogen. And then after menopause, other sort of pathways, the mutations kick in, and those are the things that stimulate growth after menopause. So in older patients, estrogen likely plays less of a role because there's not much estrogen around. And to kind of go along with that, the incidence of meningiomas in older sort of men and older women postmenopausal, it tends to more equalize. So in very old patients, men and women can get meningiomas about the same rate. So
yeah. Besides radiation, are there any other environmental exposures being investigated as potential causes of meningioma?
You mentioned the most common one, radiation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's very common, and so we often see patients that got treated with radiation for another type of cancer, like leukemia or some other brain tumor, for example, they would frequently get radiation. And years down the road, sometimes decades later, they end up developing meningiomas. So that's the big environmental exposure. I am not aware of any strong evidence linking any other environmental exposure to meningioma. So radiation is the big one. Yeah.
Yeah. I also understand that radiation is also one of the causes, I mean treatments for meningioma. So is it like the different types of radiation that they're exposed to that one causes the growth of it and one causes the cure of it?
Yeah, that's really counterintuitive, and it's a great question. And it's true that even meningiomas that are induced by radiation, we treat with radiation, with more radiation. And so, yeah, the thought is that the radiation that causes meningiomas is generally a smaller amount of, it's sort of a bystander, smaller amount of radiation that causes, it's just enough radiation to cause some mutations, but it's not enough radiation to kill the cancer cells. So it can trigger some mutations that years down the road lead to the development of meningioma. And then the radiation that we give to treat the meningioma is a much higher dose and a much more focused dose on the meningioma tumor. And so that dose of radiation is able to kill the meningioma cells. Yeah.
Yeah, so you talked about radiation therapy, but what kind of other therapeutic options are there? Because you said that there are many, so.
Yeah, well, there's not too many, but there's a few. So the most common kind of first-line therapy for meningioma is surgery, and obviously that would be performed by a neurosurgeon, not me as a neuro-oncologist. And the goal with surgery is to get as much of the tumor out as we can, because we know if we're able to get out all of the tumor, that's often curative. You can actually cure meningiomas if you get all the tumor out. Sometimes it's not possible to get all of it out because of the location of the tumor. It might be near some critical structures. And so those tumors where only part of the tumor is taken out are more likely to come back. But not all of them. In fact, a lot of them don't come back, but some of them do. And that's one of the big problems with meningiomas, is that we don't have a good handle on which meningiomas will come back and which ones will just hang out and remain stable for many, many years. So that's a very active area of research, because it really dictates the treatment. Because if we want to, so that the next step of treatment after surgery is radiation. So if we knew which tumors were going to grow back, then we would definitely radiate all of those so that they wouldn't come back. On the flip side, we don't want to unnecessarily radiate tumors that will never ever come back. So we really want to know which tumors are the ones that are going to grow and come back, and which ones are the ones that are just going to hang out and not do anything for many years, so that we can dictate our treatments accordingly. And then, so surgery, radiation, and then there are some medical therapies that I would prescribe as a neuro-oncologist for meningioma, but the problem is that they don't work that well. So these are kind of the third line therapies. After a patient's already had surgery and radiation, sometimes on multiple occasions. And if the meningioma is still growing, then we have a few treatments. Again, I'll mention a couple of them, but they don't work all that well. So one of them is the drug called Avastin that I mentioned during the glioblastoma block. Sometimes that can slow it down a little bit. And then there's another couple drugs that actually, that take advantage of binding to some of the normal hormone receptors that are expressed on the meningioma, but they don't work that well either. So we often try them, but yeah.
All right. And with surgical removal, so let's say that we do remove 100% of the tumor. Is it possible for any regrowth, or is there like any other long-term effects that come from that surgery?
It's very possible for the meningioma to be removed completely and the patient to have no residual effects and the tumor to be completely cured. So that is something that the surgeon is aiming for. So there's always the possibility of side effects from the neurosurgery if, sometimes there can be a small bleed or something like that. But yeah, usually the neurosurgeon is able to if he or she is able to remove the whole tumor, then it's curative.
Okay, and then, so we do know that there's differences between types of meningiomas, especially like histological differences.
Yeah.
So like transitional meningiomas and fibrous meningiomas. So how would you feel does the histology of the meningioma influence treatment, or like whether or not you said it's aggressive or the location and stuff like that?
Yes, yeah. So we have a system for looking at meningiomas under the microscope and determining how aggressive they are. And so there's 3 levels, 1, 2, and 3. Up to 90% of meningiomas are the slowest growing grade 1. For those tumors, especially if we got all of it out, and oftentimes even if we get most of it out but not all of it, we just observe because a lot of those tumors don't come back. And then there are the grade 2 and the grade 3. So the grade 2 probably is about 7 or 9%, and then the grade 3 are very rare. The most aggressive ones are very rare, just like 1 to 3%. So the pathologist looks at the meningioma under the microscope, sorts it out into these groups, and then we can direct our treatments accordingly. Again, for the more aggressive for the more aggressive tumors, WHO grade 2 and it's called WHO grade 2 and WHO grade 3. We usually follow up with radiation, and those patients will likely be monitored more closely.
All right, yeah. So these meningioma subtypes obviously have some differences, like you said, for treatment and stuff like that, but how are they influencing new treatment options? Like, are people studying specific types of meningiomas to create new treatment options, or are they sort of just going at it as a whole?
That's a great question, and meningioma is not my personal area of research. I think there's a mixture of both, though. So there's a lot of interest in developing a system where we can know which meningiomas need radiation and which don't, as I mentioned earlier. So in targeting our radiation to the most aggressive tumors that are most likely to come back. That is a very active area of research. And then, yes, there are researchers who are looking at ways to target the different mutations that may happen in meningiomas. So NF2 is a little bit harder to target with drugs because it's a gene called a tumor suppressor, but there are oncogenes in meningioma. So, for example, there are certain meningiomas that happen more often at the base of the brain, and they're more likely to have mutations in certain genes. I'm not sure the names matter, but smooth end or the AKT pathway, and we have drugs that could potentially block those pathways. And so, yes, I think there are opportunities for personalized medicine where we could develop treatments for specific types of meningiomas with specific mutations.
Yeah, and then to compare with our last section, glioblastomas, do you think, so you study gliomas and glioblastomas, do you think there's a lot of similarities that you can diagnose with, or does it make it, are there a lot of differences between the two that makes it hard, that makes it easy to diagnose with, or do you struggle to diagnose the two?
Diagnosis is usually not a problem because they look very, very different on an MRI scan. So meningiomas form from the lining of the brain, as you mentioned. And so they're usually attached to the line. They're still attached to the lining of the membrane, and they're actually outside of the brain proper. Whereas gliomas happen within the brain and send out their tentacles throughout the brain. So they usually look pretty dramatically different on MRI. Yeah.
That's it for meningiomas. Now we're going to move on to pituitary tumors.
Hi, my name is Wanshu.
Hi, my name is Zahid, and we will now start talking about pituitary tumors. So pituitary tumors are abnormal growths in the pituitary gland of the brain, which controls the body's hormone levels. Although most pituitary tumors are benign, they can cause major problems like headaches, vision issues, and disrupt hormone levels. Although the exact cause of pituitary tumors are not identified yet, scientists think that genetics and stress may play a role. Annually, about 10,000 cases are diagnosed in the US. Although no single cure has been identified yet, treatment includes surgery, radiation, and medications that control hormone levels. So now we will begin with the questions.
So in our research, we found that stress plays a pretty significant role in the development of pituitary tumors. Could you explain how exactly stress plays that role?
Yeah, so just as a kind of intro, the pituitary gland is a pea-sized piece of tissue that sits at the base of the brain, kind of behind the nose. And despite its small size, it is an incredibly important organ. I mean, it's the master regulator of all the hormones in the body. Controls hormones involved in appetite and metabolism and regulation of blood sugars and blood pressure and sexual characteristics, water levels in the body, and hormones that are released in response to stress. So the pituitary is a very important organ when it comes to responding to any sort of stress because it regulates levels of cortisol, which are the main stress hormone. So certainly any tumor that is in the pituitary could affect the body's ability to deal with stress. I am not aware of good research evidence showing that stress leads to a pituitary tumor, though. So certainly after you have the tumor, your ability to deal with stress is definitely could certainly be influenced. But I think pituitary tumors, from what we are aware of, are formed from the same way that a lot of cancers that we've already talked about are formed, is from mutations in DNA. And that causes abnormal growth of certain cells in the pituitary gland. But I don't think that stress itself could lead to, or at least we have evidence that stress itself leads to a pituitary tumor. Yeah.
Next question is that how can a tumor in the pituitary gland affect things like energy levels, weight, or growth?
Yeah. So that I think is definitely something that could commonly happen because the pituitary, just to kind of enumerate, so it regulates thyroid hormone, which is important in energy levels and metabolism and appetite. It regulates cortisol, the stress hormone. It regulates, it secretes LH and FSH, which regulate sexual function and sexual characteristics. The growth hormone is regulated by the pituitary. If you have a tumor that's growing inside the pituitary and it ends up pressing on some of these very important hormone producing cells, then those important hormones levels could go down. So you might not be able, your metabolism might go down, or your cortisol levels might go down, or the hormones involved in sexual function could go down. So just it being a very small area, a small tumor could end up causing those hormonal symptoms.
Can these levels also be overexpressed?
Yes, yeah. So there's two kind of, I guess, two big flavors of pituitary, and we were talking about pituitary adenomas. Is kind of what I gathered. So that's kind of one of the more common pituitary tumors. So pituitary adenomas are divided into two main flavors. So there are the ones that don't secrete any hormones, practically speaking, and then there are the pituitary tumors that do secrete certain hormones. The more common hormones that may be secreted by pituitary adenomas are prolactin. So that is a hormone for milk production, but increased levels of it can also interfere with sexual function in men and women. And growth hormone, so that's another hormone that could be produced by the pituitary adenoma. So in kids, if you end up having too much growth hormone, you grow really tall, and that's called gigantism. If the tumor happens when you're a grown-up, then your hands and your feet get really big, and your facial features get kind of coarse, and you get side effects like high blood pressure and high blood sugars, and that's called acromegaly. So, and then I suppose the other one that can happen is pituitary adenomas that secrete too much, that end up stimulating too much cortisol secretion, the stress hormone. So that causes a very characteristic syndrome where people gain weight, their blood sugars go up, their blood pressure goes up, their faces balloon out, their skin gets really thin, and they have stretch marks. And that's called Cushing's disease. But that's how I would think. I think a lot of doctors too think about it as either non-functioning pituitary adenomas or the functioning ones that secrete these excess hormones. Yeah.
Okay, so we found that a lot of the symptoms are pretty similar to other diseases. So what are the biggest challenges in diagnosing pituitary tumors early on?
Yeah, good question. So there is one unique symptom that happens with pituitary adenomas, and that's something, it's a vision problem. It's called bitemporal hemianopsia, or more commonly tunnel vision. So you lose the ability to see out in your periphery. And the reason that happens is it's kind of a cool neuroanatomy factoid. So the pituitary gland, I said, is this little pea-sized organ. It sits in a little seat. It's called the sella turcica, which literally means the Turkish seat. Right above the pituitary is something called the optic chiasm, where the optic nerves that are carrying all the information from the eyes, they go right to that optic chiasm, and then they split off and go to the back of the brain where vision is processed. So if a tumor grows in the pituitary, it can't grow down because there's the base of the skull there. It often will end up growing up, and it will compress those crossing optic nerves. And it often compresses at the point where the fibers that are seeing the peripheral vision end up getting affected. And that's why you get this very characteristic bitemporal hemianopsia. So it's often very subtle, but sometimes it may be more apparent that people are having trouble like changing lanes, or they're bumping into things because their peripheral vision is disrupted. So if you hear that, a patient telling you that, then you would think about a pituitary adenoma. But you're right. I mean, the other symptoms are kind of nonspecific, headaches, things like that. So, but the good news is that when we get an MRI scan of the whole brain, it includes the pituitary gland usually. So usually you would at least get a clue from the MRI scan that there's something abnormal going on in the pituitary.
Just to follow up, would everyone with an aggressive pituitary adenoma have the vision problem, or is it only select people?
It only happens in a portion, because it depends on the size of the pituitary adenoma and exactly how it grows. So, but it does happen in a significant portion of people, yeah.
So what kind of tests would you run to diagnose it?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, because often it's subtle, right? People don't always realize that they just can't see all the way to the periphery. So what you do is it's called a visual field test. So you go to the ophthalmologist, and they flash different lights in your vision, and you click the clicker to say that you can see it. And so that's actually oftentimes the only way that the doctors might pick it up, actually, is you have to go in for this formal test to really see that your peripheral vision is affected.
But you can still do imaging, CT scans, and with those to detect tumors.
Yes. So you do both. Yeah, you do the vision testing, and you do the MRI scan is the most precise, most sensitive, and can pick up tumors that are even less than a centimeter usually. Yeah.
So now, after you diagnose the tumor, how do you guys determine whether a pituitary tumor should be treated with surgery, or radiation, or medication?
Yes, good question. So this is an area where it is helpful to think about the non-functioning pituitary adenomas versus the functioning ones. So for the non-functioning ones, the ones that are not secreting hormones, generally speaking, and again, this is a decision that's made by a surgeon, not by me, but generally, you go see a surgeon and they evaluate your MRI scan, look at how big it is, how likely it is to grow, and the first line treatment, if one is offered, is generally surgery. And it's a very particular type of surgery. It's called a transsphenoidal approach, where they go in through the nose and they take out as much of the tumor as they can. If they're able to get all of it, then that can be curative. Sometimes they can't get all of it because it's attached to really important nerves or blood vessels at the base of the skull, and that's where radiation can be helpful. So if there's tumor remaining after the surgery, then they'll be followed up with some radiation, and that's usually really effective at preventing regrowth of the tumor. These pretty well controlled with radiation. And then for the functioning tumors, again, I'm stepping outside my area because this is often, there's something called a neuroendocrinologist that will, someone with special training in endocrinology that will deal with these type of tumors. But broadly speaking, you can manage those medically in a lot of cases. So for example, the more common one would be like a prolactinoma. So a pituitary adenoma that secretes prolactin. And we have a treatment for that called cabergoline. So it's a drug. It's a pill that you take that will decrease levels of prolactin, and it actually also can shrink the tumor too. And there's a couple other medications that are used for other secreting adenomas as well. So those are but those can often be treated with medication. Yeah.
Okay, so similar to the treatment aspect of it, what are some of the side effects of taking medication for a pituitary tumor? And if taken in extreme doses, will it stunt a person's growth? As you mentioned that pituitary adenomas do have very close relation to hormones.
Stunted growth is usually not a problem because the patients are either already too tall or too, their hands and feet are too big, they're basically past the age at which they need to grow. That's usually not a problem. I'm thinking about, so some of the commonly used medications for pituitary tumors, like I mentioned, cabergoline. So that is a medication that activates dopamine actually in the brain, and so it can have some side effects. Can make you a little bit more impulsive, for example. But most people are able to tolerate cabergoline pretty well. There's another one called octreotide, which is also pretty well tolerated, and usually patients can take it at least for a period of time to control their pituitary tumor. So usually these medications overall are pretty well tolerated.
Since pituitary tumors are highly individualized, as you said, there's like different types, like some express hormones while others are just growing.
Yeah.
So like when it comes to treatment, are all pituitary tumors treatable? And if not, like what makes it treatable?
Yeah, I would say, there are a lot of treatment options for pituitary adenomas. We've already covered surgery, radiation, and various medical therapies. And those are often, almost always, very effective in controlling the tumor and also in decreasing levels of the aberrantly expressed hormone. In rare cases, and this is usually actually where I get involved, is in the really rare and tough cases, the tumor can spread and can grow in odd ways. So it could potentially spread to other areas of the brain. Again, this is very rare. And in that situation, the options for treatment get a little bit more limited and it gets a little bit more challenging. Sometimes we do have to use chemotherapy for these tumors that are particularly aggressive and is spread to other parts of the brain. So the chemotherapy that we often use is one that we use for other tumors called temozolomide, and that can work for these more aggressive pituitary tumors. You can radiate other areas where the tumor has spread, but it becomes more of just trying to keep things stable with either radiation or chemotherapy, and sometimes they're just not curative. They're not curable, but usually we can keep things stable at least for a while with these treatments. Yeah.
So usually I've heard with cancers, usually it's when you're in the earlier stages, that's when you try to treat it, but when you're in later stage 4, it's more just trying to prolong the patient's life. So is it more do you usually administer treatments radiation, surgery when it's in the early stage of the cancer, or when it's later?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so surgery usually happens earlier, and generally speaking, and for if you get all of the pituitary adenoma out, that could be curative, and so that's often the goal. And then radiation comes into play if the surgeon was not able to get all of it out, then radiation is needed to treat the remaining tumor. And then radiation can be used in what we call the salvage setting later on. If the tumor grows back or it spreads to other areas, then we can use radiation. Yeah.
Okay, so because of how significant the pituitary gland is in the body, are there any patterns that pituitary tumors have with other diseases like diabetes?
Good question. So I'm not aware of sort of a direct correlation between common systemic medical conditions and pituitary tumors. There are definitely genetic conditions that predispose, just like there are genetic conditions that we've already talked about that predispose patients to gliioblastoma or that predispose patients to meningioma. There are genetic conditions that predispose to pituitary tumors. So the one that's more common would be multiple endocrine neoplasia type 1. Those patients are particularly at risk for pituitary adenomas due to a mutation that they have in their body. Makes them more likely to have pituitary adenomas. Yeah.
So our last question is, are pituitary tumors often misdiagnosed because of the diverse symptoms that they present?
Sometimes it can be a diagnostic challenge because usually we can see it on the MRI scan, but there are other masses that can show up in that area other than a pituitary adenoma. So you can get other types of tumors in that area. You can get a meningioma in that area. You can get a type of tumor called a craniopharyngioma in that area. You can get inflammatory conditions in that area. So sometimes it can be hard to tell just based on the MRI scan alone and the symptoms. And sometimes we follow the patients over time to get a better idea, but ultimately sometimes you just have to go do the surgery and get a biopsy, get a sample of the lesion that's growing in that area and see what it is, see what type of tumor it is, or see if it's inflammation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for answering all of our questions. It was very insightful. I would like to now pass it on to Aditya so we can move on to our conclusion.
That was it for our interview. Thank you so much, Dr. Rogawski, for taking your time out to come out here and answer our questions.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Keep on watching for future videos, and that's a wrap for today. Thank you.